concerned about what's happening in Cote d'Ivoire, in West Africa. I'm very close to the situation. I've had occasion to be there in the last few years, 9 different times. I know the president that is there, the current president and his wife, Laurent and Simone Gbagbo. I know that I was familiar with the election that came around. So I've been on the floor talking about what I really believe should happen there, that we should call for a new election. Unfortunately, the United States and our State Department, I'll be very critical of them, they have joined with the United Nations and with France in taking the side of Alassane Ouattara from the north, who was the challenger, who's been challenging this administration now for at least 10 years that I know of. And I got a scathing reply from the ambassador to the United States from France, and I'm not going to read it. I'm not going to enter it into the record. It doesn't make any sense. I only want to mention a couple of things and respond to a couple of things that were in that letter. First of all, they talk about the fact that this was a legitimate election and that it was certified properly and it was in accordance with the Constitution of Cote d'Ivoire, and I don't believe that's, I would respond to that by saying the independent Electoral Commission did not fulfill its constitutional mandate to announce the final provision vote tallies within 3 days. That's what the Constitution says in the country of Cote d'Ivoire and West Africa. It announced them almost 16 hours after it was constitutionally mandated to report them to the Constitutional Council. And it's my understanding that it is the Constitutional Council of Cote d'Ivoire and not the Electoral Commission which certifies and declares the winner of presidential elections. On 3 occasions now, I've talked about how this election was, the abuses that were taking place. In one case, we had information that was given to me by members of the opposing party to President Gbagbo, where they submitted that in one of the 5 regions in the north, now let's keep in mind the challenger, Ouattara, is from the north, the Muslim area up there. They had in 5 of these regions, they had in one of them 149,598, and I showed how it was calculated. I showed the actual results that were there from the electoral process, and this was just one of 5 northern cities. But when the total was officially reported in the total vote column, Ouattara receives 244,000 votes, a difference of almost 95,000 votes. Now, if you do your math and you say that this happened in all 5 of these areas in northern Cote d'Ivoire, that would be more than enough to declare enough mistakes that would take the election away from the duly elected, re-elected President Gbagbo. They stated that the, and I think it's, if you don't want to get into the weeds that far, all you have to do, Mr. President, is look at the results that they had. In that election, they came out with the results that said that Gbagbo in those northern precincts, we call them precincts, they call them something else, that he actually had thousands and thousands of votes in what we would call the primary, but when the primary runoff came up, he got 0 votes. That is a statistical impossibility. So those things, I've given them all to our State Department, and I really haven't gotten any positive response. In the accusations in the letter that the French say that he refused to accept, he being Gbagbo, refused to accept proposals by the American Union high-level group while these proposals have been formally accepted by President Ouattara. That's not true. It's just flat not true. As late as March 27th, the African Union sent former Cape Verde Foreign Minister Jose Brito to mediate between Ouattara and Gbagbo. Gbagbo accepted the mediation. Ouattara didn't. I have a whole list of things, the accusations that were made in my response to these accusations, and I'm going to be submitting them at this portion in my presentation in lieu of reading them at this time. I ask unanimous consent that be included in the record at this point.
Without objection.
Now, I come to the conclusion that on Wednesday, April 6th, it marked the 17th anniversary of a terrible thing that happened in Rwanda, the genocide that came. And we have information that actually Secretary General Kofi Annan had knowledge of that. It wasn't shared, We didn't have warning, and we all know of the 800,000 plus people that were brutally murdered in Rwanda during that genocide. What I want to do now is make sure that we're on record in warning the United States, France, and the United Nations that what is going on right now. First of all, if you look, they say it's all decided, everyone's made up their minds, and yet President Obiang is president of the Equatorial Guinea. He's also the current president of the African Union, or the chief of the African Union. And he is on record saying that Africa must be allowed to manage its own affairs. And this is a quote: "Africa does not need any external influence. Africa must manage its own affairs." And this is the president who is the head right now of the African Union. President Sarkozy, he had said, so there's no doubt about whether or not he's authorized his troops to go in there and participate in these raids that have taken place, two of them that I'll describe in just a minute. French President, this is reported on BBC News, he said, Nicolas Sarkozy said in a statement he had authorized 1,600 strong French Licorne forces in the country. Well, that shows definitely, and I don't think anyone is questioning that. Here's another one. One source said soldiers from 1,000-strong French Licorne, this is a very strong force, in Ivory Coast, has been deployed in Zone 4 in the south of the city. I think also it's important to see that France has authorized its military, and I'm reading now from the same Reuters report, authorized its military to participate in a United Nations operation in the Ivory Coast to protect civilians against escalating violence there. The Élysée Palace said the operation aimed to neutralize the heavy weapons belonging to troops loyal to President Gbagbo. So he's talking about sending them in. And of course, I think most of us, well, I'll go ahead and read one more thing here that I think is significant. French helicopters opened fire on military camp in Abidjan on Monday night. That's going to go down in history as Black Monday. And if anyone wants to see really what was happening with helicopters and with rockets firing on all kinds of targets near the palace in the residence in Abidjan, Cote d'Ivoire, go to my website, inhofe.senate.gov, and you can pull it up. We have pictures of that. In fact, I have pictures of that right here that I will be entering into the record at the conclusion of my remarks. The earlier French President Nicolas Sarkozy said he had authorized France's military to join the operation against the forces loyal to Ivory Coast, Laurent Gbagbo. So clearly, they're the ones that had. Now, I want to say this. There are two major assaults on Cote d'Ivoire. I mistakenly thought that the French were involved in the one in a city called Duquay. I find out later that they weren't. They were supporting, of course, the Ouattara, the forces that were there, but they did not have a direct participation in it. A man, Guillaume Ngefa, was the head of the United Nations mission in Cote d'Ivoire. He said that Ouattara's forces had carried out the killings in Duquay. And we have pictures. I'm quoting them now. We have pictures. We have evidence. This is retaliation. That's what the deputy head of the mission in Cote d'Ivoire, the United Nations mission, said. And then, quote, "We have credible reports of serious abuses being committed by Ouattara's side." That came from Corinne Dufka, a Human Rights Watch researcher based in Dakar, Senegal. It's raising very serious concerns. Then further quotes, and it goes on and on. I'm going to enter all of these quotes into the record, but the bottom line here is that the Ouattara's forces are the ones that were involved in Duquay when the estimate that they have right here that comes from the Patrick Nicholson, a spokesman for the Catholic Aid Agency, saying that an agency team in town last week on a routine aid mission had found a lot of dead bodies. We estimate between 800 and 1,000 dead. Nicholson said in a telephone interview from Rome, they were primarily killed by gunshot, though some of the wounds were made by machetes. And I don't think they were killed in a crossfire. It's interesting because the forces of the president, Gbagbo had left that area of Duque a week before all of that happened. So that had to have happened with those forces that were of Ouattara's. Well, anyway, Ouattara's forces, and I'm still quoting from that, and this is printed in Washington Post, have also been accused of carrying out reprisal killings and extrajudicial executions of prisoners during their march to the capital. And Gbagbo's forces had vacated a week before. Now, I think to further, and we have pictures which I will enter into the record showing the French flags that were on the major massacre that took place, and that was the one that took place on Monday night. And so I've already said all of this on the floor, and we've talked about this and the problems. One thing I haven't mentioned is one of the first things that Ouattara did when he marched on Cote d'Ivoire in the south and on Abidjan is to release all the prisoners in one of the major Abidjan prisons. That's some 5,000 prisons, and military source loyal to the Ivorian incumbent leader Gbagbo said the doors of the MACA prison, that's the big prison in that area, were opened by forces loyal to the presidential claimant Alassane Ouattara in the midst of an offensive aimed at toppling Gbagbo. Afterwards, and they go into detail as to hearing the gunfire and all of that. In other words, releasing prisoners to fight against the sitting president. Residents near the jail said thousands of youth streamed out of the prison, and which had the capacity of 3,000 prisoners, but was believed to be holding over 5,000 into the neighborhood in Abidjan. Quote, "We heard gunfire earlier this morning, and afterwards the doors of the prison were opened and prisoners were left shouting for joy." So that is actually, and that's something I had not had in the record before. One of the things that I have to repeat that I've stated before. Now, let me ask the chair how much time I have remaining.
1 minute.
I request an additional 10 minutes.
Without objection.
Thank you very much. Was one of the testimonials in Duque was, "I spot 4 pigs eating something dark and charred in the courtyard, standing by a newly dug mass grave. A UN soldier from Morocco is choking with rage and grief. I ask him if any of the dead are children. He nods and begins to sob quietly into his face mask." This is something that has been happening. Again, we talked about this before, and I don't want to abuse the time we have, but I just a few minutes ago got a notice from somebody I happen to know, and he says, I must admit that this was very difficult. This day, too, we're talking about in the last few hours, has been very confusing with the rebels parading in the streets, stealing and disposing people for their goods. This is what makes it very dangerous because it's a low-law zone. Hundreds of people have been started leaving the town to avoid the danger in Abidjan. So that's what's happening right now. The reports that we have now recently is that the Ouattara rebel army is deploying death squads. And I would read from this because I think it's very important that we get this down right, because I'm going to make some accusations here that maybe have never been made in recent history on this floor. I've just received devastating news about the situation in Cote d'Ivoire. I've been told that there are death squads roving around the streets of Abidjan. They use the word disappearing supporters. Did they kill the supporters of President Gbagbo? Probably so, but they use the word disappearing because there's no accounting of them. These death squads are led by soldiers of Ouattara's rebel army. They have already killed 400 people in the last few hours. I'm talking about contemporary right now. If we do nothing, this soon will include the murder of President Gbagbo and his wife Simone. Ouattara's armed rebels are supported by militarily by the United Nations and the French government. So I call upon the United Nations Secretary General Ban Ki-moon and French President Sarkozy to condemn and halt immediately these death squads. Now, if they don't do it, I would charge that they are complicit in allowing these death squads to operate freely in the streets in Abidjan. And it also calls for immediate immediate ceasefire. I'll conclude and just say that I remember well because I was around when this happened, and when we knew, some people knew, we didn't know in advance what was going to happen in Rwanda. President Kagame didn't know what was going to happen in Rwanda, but Kofi Annan apparently for the United Nations did know what was going to happen, and elected not to say anything about it, so that they weren't warned. And 800,000 mutilations later, we know what the genocide was all about. But we know now. We know the death squads are there. The death squads have already killed, according to these reports, some 400 people in the last few hours. And if we don't do anything about it, I have in my own mind, I feel very certain that those death squads that are run by Ouattara's rebel army will reach the hiding place of President Gbagbo and his wife Simone and their family, and they too will be murdered. So if we don't do anything, we have now been warned that that can happen, and the very easy way to stop it would be to intervene and stop the death squads that are roaming around in Abidjan in the country of Cote d'Ivoire. With that, I will yield the floor in a suggested absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.